Okay. Order, order. Can I remind honourable members that there have been some changes to normal practice in order to support the new hybrid arrangements? Timings of debates have been amended to allow technical arrangements to be made for the next debate. There will also be suspensions between debates. Can I remind members participating both physically and virtually that they must arrive for the start of debates in Westminster Hall and are expected to remain for the entire debate? And can I remind them that they are visible at all times, both to each other and to us in the Boothroyd room. If members attending virtually have any technical problems, please can they email the Westminster Hall clerk's email address. And members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and as they leave the room. We don't have any members in the public gallery, so I shall omit the part about moving seats once somebody has spoken. I call Chris Evans to move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 570779, which calls for no consent to be given for another referendum on Scottish independence. The petition received 109,929 signatures. The petition says the independence referendum was called a once-in-a-generation vote, so let it be. I would like to thank the petitioner for creating this petition. In preparation for this speech, I spoke to the petitioner who wished to remain anonymous. They told me this is because they fear the abuse they will receive for creating a petition on the subject. They know that the independence debate has become extremely divisive. Unfortunately, a lot of the political discussion around independence is not constructive or measured, but deeply emotive and all-consuming. The creator of this petition believes that the focus of political debate in Scotland has been too solely centred on independence at the expense of other extremely important issues. They feel the political time and resources are being funneled into debates on independence instead of being used to address pressing issues in Scotland. Instead of resources being spent on independence, hope that, once independence is gained, all problems will be solved. The petitioner would like Scottish politicians to look to local problems now. They mention the need to tackle the rise in the use of food banks, the problems the Scottish hospitals face, all powers they feel the Scottish Government already hold. One of the other issues that was mentioned by the petitioner as an area they would like to see the Scottish Government focusing on is education, which is already a devolved matter. The long-term costs of the pandemic will fall disproportionately on today's children whose education has also been impacted this year through lost learning. It's absolutely vital that education is prioritised to assure the economic recovery and growth of Scotland after the pandemic. The number of full-time or equivalent teachers in Scotland's schools has fallen by 1,700 since 2007, while the ratio of pupils to teachers in Scottish secondary schools is at its highest since 2013. For pupils in primary 1 through 3, only 14% are in a class with fewer than 18 pupils, despite promises to cap the class size at 18 in 2007. This is seriously worrying. The Scottish Government has these powers, cannot blame Westminster for these problems. The Scottish Government should focus on delivering promises made 14 years ago, rather than rerunning a referendum from 2014. I fail to see how a divisive second referendum will help children in Scottish schools. Ultimately, to my mind, the problem is this. It always seems to be jam tomorrow. What is the point in more powers that the powers already held by the Scottish Government are not being used properly? Even when the Scottish Government are offered more powers, they defer and delay them. SNP ministers have twice asked the DWP to delay the devolution of the benefit system, in 2016 and again in 2018. Last year, Scottish ministers revealed that full devolution of the benefits would only be completed in 2024. In June, they pushed this back further to 2025. If the Scottish Government's progress on disability benefits are anything to go by, some of Scotland's most vulnerable people have to wait a decade for benefits to be up and running in a separate Scotland. Frankly, it is laughable that some have claimed it would only take 18 months from an independent vote to set up an independent state. On one hand, the SNP say publicly they simply cannot deliver the Scotland vision without more powers. Yet quietly, when they're due to get more powers, they say, not yet, we are ready. It is too simple to just blame everything on Westminster. I know it's tempting, I know the frustration of opposition, but you should try to find solutions rather than taking powers for power's sake. I see today the Scottish Government has published draft legislation on holding a second independence referendum. It's all well and good saying that the immediate priority is dealing with the pandemic and keeping the country safe. But why publish this bill now? It is quite clear what the Scottish Government's focus is. Even if the worst effects of the pandemic are over, recovery will take a considerable amount of time, and the Scottish Government should be focused on this. Given the current emphasis in political discussion among the SNP on Scottish independence, you'll be forgiven for querying the headlines that we are in one of the largest health and economic crises since World War II. Each hour of political debate given over independence is an hour not spent discussing how Scottish businesses and tourism will recover from COVID, or discussing how to tackle unemployment and poverty, or the problems of waiting times in Scottish hospitals. Hospitals around the UK have been put under enormous pressure during this pandemic, and all those who staff them have done incredible work. They've taken extra shifts, have put their psychological and physical health at risk, and have gone above and beyond to save lives during the pandemic. As we begin to look how and where hospitals will need support to recover and grow in the future, Scotland needs to look at their hospitals and realise that a lot of work needs to be done to fully support them. Rather than focusing all political energies on independence, the discussion ought to be focused urgently on the mental health crisis that the pandemic has highlighted, on the waiting times in Scottish hospitals, and on the health of the population. Right now, politicians ought to be concentrating on the health and economic crisis this pandemic has brought about. Provision of food parcels and food aid has grown significantly in Scotland in the last 10 years. In 2009, there was one Trussell Trust food bank operating in Scotland. By April 27, this has increased to 52. With 119 centres, some operate satellite centres in various locations in the surrounding area. They better serve those who are unable or cannot afford to travel easily to them. The number of families who've had to rely on food banks has risen during the pandemic. I understand these problems are not unique to Scotland, but I do not think they're helped by the obsession with independence. I know those who shout the loudest often get the attention, but I do not think most people want their government focused on constitutional matters in the middle of a crisis. Rather than spending political energy on independence, shouldn't the SNP be ensuring that every family can put food on the table? Shouldn't they be making sure that the Scottish Parliament are doing everything they can to make sure that economic effects of the pandemic do not result in further increase in those relying on food banks? Even before the pandemic, around 1 million people in Scotland were living in poverty, and suddenly set to rise. In 2019, an estimated 24.6% of all Scottish households were in fuel poverty. There's almost a quarter of all families. Let's not beat around the bush here. This shows an urgent problem with fuel poverty among Scottish families. Now is not the time to discuss constitutional change. Now is the time to look at what can be done to prevent poverty, to aid those who face unemployment or homelessness. This year has also seen the UK's exit from the European Union. Alongside the changes the pandemic has brought, the petitioners voiced that they would like to see politicians have some time for the dust to settle on these two issues before more political unrest is contemplated. It is surely not the answer to Brexit. The answer to Brexit to do exactly the same as Scottish independence. It doesn't make sense to cut off your nose to spite your face. If a second referendum is deemed necessary, then now is certainly not the time. We need to focus on recovering from this pandemic and allow for the results of Brexit to become clearer and more settled before any constitutional change can be even considered. The SNP have consistently said there could be a referendum this year. Thankfully, the Scottish public have rejected this in large numbers. Can it really be appropriate to even consider such a divisive and destructive referendum this year? In 2014, the Scottish First Minister said, sure, people would see it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Scotland in the independence vote. Well, the people of Scotland voted, and they voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. I was on the losing side of a Brexit referendum 2 years later. Never once did I call for a second referendum. I knew we had to accept the democratic will of the people and make the best of it. You cannot simply rerun referendums until you get the answer you were looking for. Quite frankly, if the past 5 years have shown us anything, is quite how divisive referendums can be. The SNP should be leading the people of Scotland, not misleading them by saying there are simple solutions to Scottish problems, telling them tales of an imaginary utopia with Scotland outside the UK, with Scotland outside of the United Kingdom. Rather than picking at all wounds, they should focus on using the powers they have to help the Scottish people. Ultimately, the obsession with independent Scotland is driving a wedge between families and friends, neighbours and communities. The petitioners shared with me the fears they felt about abuse aimed their way because they want to remain part of the United Kingdom. The family was so nervous about abuse they asked the petitioner to remove their name from the petition. This is not a healthy discourse. It is one that results from offering simple solutions to complex problems. Even as I agreed to lead this debate for the Petitions Committee, I was warned to expect abuse online. It's not surprising, really, that people are angry when they've been told that it's a simple solution to all of Scotland's problems, and the rest of the UK is standing in the way of that. if I thought this was true, that all that stands in the way of a great education system, an end to poverty and a fairer society of the Scottish people within independent Scotland, I would be happy to fight alongside the Scottish Government. However, nothing is ever as simple as that. It takes hard work to solve any problem. Ms Noakes, rather than focusing on jam today, let us work together as 4 nations to achieve the best for all our people. Let devolved governments use the powers they have effectively, rather than focusing on what powers they can take next. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 570779 relating to consent for a referendum on Scottish independence. Before I call the next speaker, I do have to tell members that I'm going to instigate a 3.5-minute time limit from the beginning. Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I also thank the member for introducing today's debate. Of course, we had many of these arguments last week in the Chamber of the House of Commons when the SNP used their rare party business time to debate a similar topic. But on that occasion, it was to hold another independence referendum. But as we heard from the member introducing today's debate, the title today is Opposition to Another Independence Referendum, signed by well over the 100,000 threshold to have this matter debated in Parliament, and the decision millions of Scots took back in 2014. So they must be looking at the news today from the SNP Scottish Government and wondering, why has Nicola Sturgeon and her party just turned 2 fingers up at them and said, we don't care what you think, we're forging ahead with another independence referendum bill in the next Parliament, launching that bill today to take us back to the division of the past rather than focusing on our recovery from COVID-19 and rebuilding Scotland from the after effects of this most damaging pandemic. And I must also say it hit home to me when the member opening this debate said that the petitioner and the lead petitioner wish to remain anonymous because of the state of the debate of Scottish politics right now. On a day I've found out from police that someone has been charged with making a very graphic death threat against myself and another Scottish politician. This is the state of politics in Scotland right now. This is what the SNP want to take us back to. This is what the SNP want us to be debating in the days, weeks and months ahead. That division that separates families and workplaces, divides communities. We don't need all that all over again. What we need is a laser-like focus in the next Scottish Parliament on ensuring that we can recover from COVID-19, we can rebuild from this pandemic, and that should be all politicians and all parties' #1 priority. But again, today we have heard that it's not the priority for the SNP. They believe separation over securing a recovery for Scotland. And I hope what we get today in this note from the SNP members speaking, and I know the member for Ochil and South Perthshire is coming straight after me, is some answers to some very basic questions people across Scotland will be asking right now. If the SNP's desire is to take us back into that divisive debate again, can they answer some pretty basic questions? Basic questions I put to the SNP Shadow Chancellor on numerous occasions in the debate last week. Can any of the SNP members in today's debate tell us what currency an independent Scotland would have? Can any of the SNP members in today's debate tell us what it would mean for a border between Scotland and England? Can any of the SNP members in today's debate tell us what it will mean for our armed forces here in Murray, at Kinloss Barracks and Area Lossiemouth or across Scotland? Because as long as these questions go unanswered, the SNP will continue to seek separation without telling the people of Scotland what it will mean for individuals, for families and communities right up and down this country. But we can move beyond this division. We can say to people we don't need another independence referendum, and we can focus on rebuilding Scotland. And people can do that by giving both their votes to the Scottish Conservatives at the election in a few weeks' time to ensure our focus is on recovery and rebuilding, not on more referendums. Thank you very much.
John Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to follow the member for Murray. He's clearly not heard that the Hamilton report has found no breach of the ministerial quota. I know he'd have wanted to have been gracious and congratulated the First Minister. Now, I understand people who once opposed Scottish independence. My dad saw himself as a proud Scottish patriot, but a youth forged in war and then the values of a shared welfare state made him feel Scottish, British, and because of his wartime experiences, passionately pro-European. The brutality of Thatcherism in the 1980s and the imposition of Brexit has removed that triple status from many Scots who thought that they could have overlapping identities protected by a benign state which recognised that although we were smaller, we were equal. The Conservatives have disabused them of that notion. The Union could have survived. A more nimble Westminster establishment might have read the runes in 2014 and determined that the Union had a narrow escape and that equality was the way forward. Instead, drunken victory, they crashed on into a Brexit campaign and imposed the hardest of Brexits on a country which didn't want it. Brexit represents the triumph of the English nationalists over the Unionists in the Conservative Party. If you were a Scot in 2014 who voted no because you believed the Unionist promises then, you'll have been deeply disillusioned. You were told unambiguously that the way to preserve Scotland's membership of the European Union was to vote no to independence. You now know that the opposite was true. Now your choice is either to stay in Boris Johnson's narrow, insular Brexit Britain, or for Scotland to become like Denmark, a medium-sized, prosperous, socially progressive, independent member of the European Union. For me, independence has never been about the destination, but rather the gateway. It's been about getting the governments we vote for and holding them to account. It's about making Scotland the most liberal, socially progressive country in Europe. It's about honouring our old people and giving the best start in life to the young. It's about being a beacon of democracy and freedom to countries yearning for both. An independent Scotland would not have gone to war in Iraq. It wouldn't have bombed the Syrians or supplied weapons to the Saudis. An independent Scotland wouldn't have nuclear weapons. Tory members sometimes tell me privately that they know independence is inevitable, and I agree with them. However, Canute-like, they think that waves of policy-free, angry election leaflets will stem the tide. It won't. So what should we make of the campaign to stop a referendum? Please, no more of the once-in-a-generation baloney. Boris Johnson said that the last general election was a once-in-a-generation election. I doubt he meant that there would be no more general elections. Young people who missed out on voting in 2014 are now in their 20s and hungry to shape their future. Attempting to stifle their voices shows nothing but fear. I understand people who feel unionist. I don't, however, understand those who want to impose their unionism in defiance of Scotland's Parliament. The Scottish people are sovereign. We will decide our future, and no one else.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and I'm particularly pleased to serve under your chairmanship. I want to thank the 1,352 of my own constituents who signed the petition. I want to thank the member who preceded me, not so much the member for Oakhill and South Perthshire, but the member for an alternative universe. I was a member of the Scottish Parliament during the Iraq War, and what the SNP, as one of the many myths they perpetrate, the Scottish Parliament voted to support the Iraq War. I may or may not have agreed with that decision, but these wild statements that an independent Scotland would not have gone into the Iraq War are nonsense, just like the statement in relation to the EU in the Scottish referendum in 2014. It was known at the time of the Scottish referendum that there was going to be an EU referendum in the United Kingdom, and any pretence otherwise is complete nonsense. Now, this debate is timely, even though it is as my honourable friend from Murray mentioned, a rerun of many of the issues that were discussed last Wednesday, because in that debate we learned that the nationalist statement that the 2014 referendum was a once-in-a-generation event was in fact a complete and deliberate con, a trick to persuade their own supporters to go out and vote. So it's clear there was never any intention to stick to that promise, and the suspicion at the time that the SNP would keep going, pursuing a referendum until they got the answer they wanted was correct. So much for the Edinburgh Agreement, which was described as a gold standard by Alex Salmond. Of course, Alex Salmond, who at that time, the same people who are decrying him today were describing as the father of our nation and somebody whose word could be relied on. So the Edinburgh Agreement also contained that important provision that we would respect the result. But as from the 19th of September 2014, that result has not been respected. The SNP have disrespected it from that moment onwards. Nothing about something happening around the Brexit referendum, what governments and general elections post that. It was disrespected from the 19th of September 2014, and the constant call from then has been for another referendum, and even another referendum in the middle of a pandemic or in the recovery period that we will essentially need. We were told we could have a referendum by the end of this year. That is the last thing Scotland needs. We need a focus on jobs, on education, on our NHS as we rebuild after this pandemic. And, contrary to claims that that's been the focus of the SNP government, we see the incredible sight of an independence referendum bill being lodged today. It doesn't need to be like this. On the 6th of May, people can use both their votes for the Scottish Conservatives and ensure that we focus on rebuilding Scotland and not another divisive independence referendum.
Hear, hear.
Mr Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship once again. 7 years ago, in the run-up to that Scottish independence referendum, those who advocated independence did pitch it as not just a once-in-a-generation vote and opportunity, but they effectively said to the Scottish people, this is your chance, grasp it or lose it. That is effectively what they said, and the people of Scotland gave their decision, gave their outcome, gave their response, which was that they were better off together within the United Kingdom. I should say, Ms Noakes, that nationalism, whether in Scotland, in Northern Ireland or in Wales, thrives where there is perceived disadvantage. And I know from friends I've spoken to over many years that Scottish people feel that they have been disadvantaged by successive governments. That's why the levelling up approach by the current Prime Minister is essential. It is absolutely essential in delivering a better United Kingdom. That's why the vaccination programme and the success of the National Health Service vaccination programme right across the United Kingdom demonstrates that we are indeed better off together. All of the members here today who are from Scotland, all of their constituents, their Scottishness and their Britishness are not exclusive. They are complementary. It isn't very often, Ms Noakes, that I would quote with affirmation a former Labour Prime Minister. But when I heard Gordon Brown speak just before the referendum those 7 years ago, and to paraphrase what he said, that the people of Scotland had been born in the United Kingdom, they'd been born together, they'd lived in the United Kingdom together, fought in wars together in the United Kingdom, and they had died together in the United Kingdom. And that is a plea I would put out to all of the people of Scotland. We are much better off together. Let us build a truly united kingdom where all of us win, where all of us are levelled up, where progress and prosperity can be achieved and can be obtained by everyone across the United Kingdom. Thank you, Ms Noakes.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and it's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. I'm pleased to be taking part in this debate today on this petition, which has attracted so much support from across Scotland, and I'm particularly pleased to see the 1,894 of my constituents of Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk signing this petition, the 11th highest of any constituency in the UK. However, I must say, if I actually went round the doors in my Borders constituency and asked people to sign a petition calling on the SNP to drop their obsession with another independence referendum, I suspect the figure would be significantly higher. Now, you might say that's no surprise, given that the Scottish Borders voted by a margin of 2-1 in 2014 for Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom. And I certainly don't get any surprise that people have changed their minds since that referendum vote in 2014, since that act of self-determination back in 2014, since that once-in-a-generation vote when Scotland voted by a margin of more than 10% to reject the case for separation. Quite the opposite, Ms Noakes. Scots are worried about the coronavirus pandemic. People are worried about the economy and their jobs. People are worried about our young people and their education. Families are worried about the health and well-being of loved ones. We're worried about whether our NHS will cope. They're certainly not thinking that now is the right time for another divisive referendum on Scotland's future. People want Scotland's two governments to be working to navigate our way through the pandemic and implementing the economic recovery plan. I think that is reflected in the fact that this petition was set up in the first place, but also that so many people felt the need to sign it. What they don't want to see is the SNP government in Edinburgh prioritising another referendum when there are so many other things that the SNP in Holyrood should be doing. But why, we ask, why are the SNP doing this? They don't want Scotland's voters to look at their record in government over the last 14 years, do they? Scotland's education standards are in decline. Scotland's NHS is in crisis. Scotland's rural broadband delivery is in chaos. Scotland's economy lagging behind. Scotland's missed climate change targets. And I could go on, Ms Noakes. And of course there's trouble in the SNP's nest too. Another reason to try to distract voters. Ripped apart by an internal civil war like we've never seen before. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, seemingly unable to tell the truth, leading the SNP government, which is corrupt, sleazy, tired, and certainly beyond its use-by date. We need to rebuild Scotland.
Maintain parliamentary language, please, Mr Lamont.
I'm grateful, Ms Noakes. I know others have, even in the Scottish Parliament, have questioned whether the First Minister has been able to tell the truth. But I apologise, Ms Noakes. We need to rebuild Scotland, end the division of the past, stop the constant talk of another independence referendum. And there is one way to do that, Ms Noakes, and that's to use both your votes in May for the Scottish Conservatives.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to have the opportunity to take part in this debate. The views of the petitioner expressed by the honourable member earlier reflect so many of the frustrations which I hear daily in Scotland, particularly from the constituents in Edinburgh West, which had the third highest number of signatories to this debate. And what I'm about to say, Madam Chair, it's not a party political point I want to make or a free pot shot at the SNP, but an appeal. We all in this place are only too painfully aware of the impact of the pandemic on our economy and the daily lives of our constituents, small businesses and families. They are struggling, they are tired, they want reassurance that their politicians, their governments will put their recovery first. Surely no reasonable person at a time when the country is going through the biggest crisis of this or any other generation can think that we should be focused on anything else. Surely no reasonable politician would say to people, we know you're worried about your job, we know you're worried about your family's future, and we know it's going to be an expensive business to rebuild. But first, we'd like you to take the time and the money to talk about a constitutional question you have already answered. And I believe that the people of Scotland have answered it more than once. At the most recent general election, only 45% of the electorate voted for the Scottish National Party, a party whose very raison d'etre separation, which takes every available moment in the chamber, every speaking opportunity here, every soundbite or quote in the Scottish media to talk about how independence would be the solution to every possible imaginable problem. They gained precisely the same proportion as voted for separatism, as I said, in the referendum in 2014. They seem happy in doing that, to put aside education, health, the economy, to argue for independence. An argument that is clear that the majority of the people in Scotland have other priorities than. They do not want to talk about independence. Well, Madam Chair, I share the priorities of the majority of the people of Scotland. And I'm also tired of the failure of the SNP to listen to the people of Scotland. with constant claims about what an independent Scotland would have done. How does the honourable member for Ochil and South Perthshire know what an independent Scotland would have done? Perhaps he has a crystal ball, which the others in this place, the others of us, are not privy to. None of us knows. I am tired of these myths and wild, baseless statements, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale for putting the record straight. I'm tired of the SNP's blame and grievance strategy at its worst at a time when we need our politicians, our governments to pull together to steer us out of our crisis. I mentioned at the beginning that Edinburgh had the third highest number of signers on the petition. The 2 seats above it in Scotland are both held by the Scottish National Party. Perhaps it would do them well to ponder that and to think that perhaps the time has come when the people of Scotland want them to put their endless grievances aside, think about the people of Scotland and put their recovery first. Thank you.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under you today. It's an important debate on an incredibly divisive and emotive topic, the future of our union. It is clear that, like all nationalists, the Scottish National Party has an unhealthy obsession with stoking division rather than celebrating the centuries of shared history, culture and values that all nations in the UK have with one another. As I recently heard stated, we are, after all, a family of nations and a nation of families. Now, like all families, different components will sometimes have different priorities or views. Yet, with our family union of Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland, I believe that we share and will always share more in common than less. Let's face it, this debate today and the talk of yet another referendum is about far more than facts and figures. The potential separation of our union is about how we, as 4 nations in the UK, view our identity and purpose in the world. For over 300 years, the people of Britain have been banded in a common union in which all have benefited. By being in this union has ensured this island has been a beacon of liberty and enterprise. This union enabled this small island of ours to lead the way in the Industrial Revolution, stand against tyranny twice in 1914 and 1939, and play a key role in the world through the 20th and 21st centuries. At each turn in our island story, Scotland has benefited from being part of this family of nations, and indeed, many Scots, from prime ministers to economists to sportsmen and women, have rightly led and continue to lead this family. In 2014, the Scottish people outright rejected the SNP's narrow nationalism, which would have this wonderful and prosperous family of nations split apart. However, yet again, the party pushes for another divisive referendum, stoking division and causing uncertainty amongst businesses and families during the worst economic downturn situation this country has faced in living memory. If the SNP truly cared about the people of Scotland, then they would respect their wishes to remain as part of the UK and not call for a referendum for at least 20 years. It was, after all, a once in a generation decision. However, it is more apparent than ever that the SNP hold nothing sacred, not the union and not the wishes of the Scottish people. While I say enough, the SNP should focus on governing the people of Scotland for the benefit of all its people, not solely for its own supporters. I therefore agree wholeheartedly with the petition we are debating here today and hope that the voices of the petitioners are heard loud and clear from the SNP members present. Thank you.
Stephen Bonner.
Thank you, Mrs Noakes, and I'm delighted to take part in this debate under your stewardship. You know, in reality, being part of the UK, many people could accept having our rights and privileges as EU citizens ripped from us in such a fashion many more simply could not. But Brexit means Brexit, came the cry from London. It is an irrefutable fact that Brexit has decimated Scotland's trade with the European Union. Last week, Businesses for Scotland reported that the month of January saw the worst collapse of Scottish trading with the European Union since comparable records began over 2 decades ago. The ONS figures show precisely how harsh this has been, with a staggering 83% drop in fish export, 59% drop in meat exports, 50% drops in dairy exports. Overall, total EU exports from Scotland are down 63%. Brexit has pushed many businesses in my constituency to the brink of bankruptcy and collapse. Warehouses lie empty, products aren't getting to the EU market on time. Transportation leaving Lanarkshire, a logistically critical distribution network, is delayed time and time again. All of this, a direct consequence of the red tape and unnecessary paperwork the UK government has created. A mess Scotland didn't wish for nor vote for. COVID is being used time and again as a convenient scapegoat for these issues. However, as James Withers, Chief Exec of Scotland Food and Drink, stated, Brexit is at the heart of the EU trade collapse. After all, non-EU markets haven't seen a crash, despite being affected by the same global pandemic. Indeed, many economists have forecast that delays at the EU border and stagnation of growth will continue for months, if not years, to come. Brexit is a disaster of the UK government's own doing. Scotland can do better, and with these harsh figures laid bare, the people of Scotland surely know this too. 22 consecutive polls have showed support for Scottish independence. Today, a new poll once again confirms Scottish independence is now seen as a necessity rather than a wish by most Scots. The Prime Minister is fond of an excuse, and in recent days he has resorted to using COVID yet again. This time, it is the main reason that an independence referendum can't take place. Madam Chair, no one is suggesting that a referendum be held during a pandemic. No one has ever suggested such. However, the Prime Minister cannot continue to deny democracy. The Prime Minister cannot continue to deny and ignore democratic mandates. And the Prime Minister cannot deny a second independence referendum. You know, I enjoyed taking part in petition debates. In particular, they are, to my mind, the truest form of our democracy in action. And this particular one has given us a chance to remind all across the UK that their opinion is valued and respected in relation to Scotland's place in the world. It's also a good time to remind the same people that when a referendum does take place, it is for the people of Scotland to determine through our democratically elected Parliament. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and can I say what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship. I'm getting a sense of déjà vu here. Obviously, we've basically just had the same debate on Thursday, but it is quite an apt metaphor for the nationalist approach to referenda. We can have the same debate twice in a row. I was then going to launch into a polemic about the sanctity of the settled will of the Scottish people, the importance of consent in our democracy, but I know it's entirely wasted on the SNP. There's the party so out of touch and arrogant that they claim to speak for an entire nation and are venal enough to claim that any criticism of their, and mindful of your call for parliamentary language, I should say knavish regime in Holyrood, are talking Scotland down. They're certainly not going to respect the outcome of a once-in-a-generation referendum. Ad nauseum we hear from nationalist members that the panacea to all the world's ills will be separation. If only we can ignore all the myriad details they've forgot to work out. Scotland will be off and up into the sunlit uplands, and then, of course, then we get the other logical fallacy that by an independent Scotland handing over control of their laws and their economy to an unelected commission in Brussels, they'll somehow make Scotland more prosperous and free. The SNP have set themselves up as pound-shop bravehearts, and I say pound-shop, we don't actually know what currency they'd be using in an independent Scotland, peddling the fantasy that a major constitutional issue can simply be passed. Meanwhile, support for the SNP is on the slide as the murky goings-on at Holyrood become more public, and support for independence slides with it. No doubt the goalposts will be shifted again after May's poll to suit the realpolitik of whatever outcome there is. But the same self-important, peevish nationalism which underpins the SNP's vision for Scotland, creating an inward-looking, less tolerant country, is still writ large. After 3 years of hard graft to get Brexit done, we're moving back out into the world, which has always been the United Kingdom's true place. We're a trading nation, and nowhere is that clearer than here at home, where trade between Scotland and the home nations is 3 times greater than the EU 27, and where public spending in Scotland is over £1,600 higher than the UK average, meaning that every person in Scotland benefits from levels of public spending substantially above those of the rest of the UK, and the SNP want to take that away, Ms Noakes. The SNP's perspective to a separation is to make Scotland poorer, less democratic and less outward-looking. I fully accept that some people wanted a different future for the UK in 2016, but we have a responsibility to one another to take the opportunities of our new reality and make it work for everyone, not constantly stoke division and acrimony in pursuit of an ill-conceived separatism. The only way to ensure that Scotland can move forward as a full partner in our national recovery from COVID and in our shared prosperity post-Brexit is for those who have a vote in May's Holyrood elections to cast both votes for the Scottish Conservative and Unionists, the only party which has a clear and consistent position in our support for the Union and a desire to get on with the day job of looking after the interests of the people of Scotland.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. This debate being called rather sums up the dysfunction of this so-called United Kingdom, a hopelessly asymmetric construct from the outset and one which now substantially exceeds the limits of what Scotland can continue to endure. The Smith Commission report in 2015 noted that nothing in this report prevents Scotland from becoming an independent country in the future should the people of Scotland so choose. And that report includes signatories from all political parties represented in Scotland, the Greens, the SNP, but also the VOW signatories, Labour, Liberal and Tory. The Better Together amalgam still clearly exists, and they speak with one voice, as usual, to deny Scotland the credit of her abilities and subscribing to a Tory Union First ideology. The petition we are debating today received almost 1/5 of its signatures from people not resident in Scotland. So today's Westminster Hall debate on whether people in Scotland should decide Scotland's future is therefore taking place because people not resident in Scotland have decided that we shouldn't allow Scotland self-determination. Democratic values cast aside here in the mother of all parliaments. Indeed, of the 13 honourable members lining up today to downplay the harm of London rule in Scotland while talking down Scotland's right to self-determination, only 5 of them represent Scottish constituencies. This explains perhaps why a consistent majority of people who actually live in Scotland now support independence. I don't doubt that out with Scotland there are those who oppose Scottish independence and do so for what they may consider very good reasons. But it's Scotland's future, so it's Scotland's choice, and the people of Scotland know it. And that's consistent with the latest poll by BMG for the Herald, which showed again a majority of support for independence. The UK is splitting up in slow motion before our eyes, but we'll change into top gear following an SNP majority in May's Scottish Parliament elections if the people of Scotland vote for the SNP's ambition for another referendum. The UK cannot refuse this under those circumstances. In Scotland, we dispensed with the irrelevance of the Labour Party in 2015 largely, and now Wales, with the north of England, are pursuing the same enterprise with enthusiasm. Therefore, since 2016, England has, it seems, embraced a populist right-wing Tory anti-EU agenda, which is their democratic right so to do, but Scotland has pursued social inclusion, fairness, opportunity, and is positive about Europe. Ms Noakes, these values and ambitions of either nation for their people are mutually exclusive. Earlier on in the debate, defence jobs had been mentioned. So let me expand on this. When in 1989 I was employed by the Navy as an apprentice aircraft engineer, I joined a workforce of over 32,000 MOD employees in Scotland. Last year, that number was under 14,000. What union dividend is that? 6 weeks on Thursday, Ms Noakes, I trust the people of Scotland to exercise their vote in such a way as to send a very clear instruction to Westminster, demanding another referendum. Not a demand from the SNP or from any political party, a demand from the sovereign people of Scotland, to which the UK will accede.
Order. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. But the reality is this petition reflects the views of a minority of people in Scotland. And just today, an opinion poll reconfirmed previous polls that people are actually in favour of a referendum in the next 5 years if the SNP get a majority. There is this small minority who believe in the union so strongly that it's their intention that there shouldn't be another referendum, no matter the will of the people. This petition is fundamentally flawed for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it puts Westminster sovereignty above the will and democratic votes of the Scottish people, which should be unacceptable for any Democrat. The petition, like nine opposition MPs last week and several today, referenced the once in a generation comment as if somehow one referendum is all we get. And yet it's conveniently ignored that constitutionally Northern Ireland can hold a referendum every 7 years. So why should democracy be blocked in Scotland? Now in 2014, the UK was still a member of the EU. It was acknowledged then that an SNP majority had paved the way for the referendum and the Edinburgh Agreement was put in place. Now it seems the British state will do anything to obstruct Scottish parliamentary democracy. So 2014 actually was a unique opportunity. Sadly, too many people believed that voting no would keep us in the EU. And unlike what the Honourable Member for Dumfriesshire said earlier, Baroness Davison tried to assure us there was no way there'd be an EU referendum. So that wasn't the information that's given to Scottish people. Then if we look at myths, we're apparently told that we were part of the most successful political union in the world. A union so successful that are now frightened to give the people another verdict on this union. And they tell us we've got the most powerful devolved parliament in the world, yet Northern Ireland's got powers over welfare, pensions and civil service that we don't have. Wallonia was able to veto the CETA deal, while Westminster wouldn't even look at Scottish Government compromise proposals and Brexit, while they're taking us out of Europe against our will and imposing a bad deal on us. And now, for good measure, the internal market bill, which undermines devolution altogether. The Scottish Parliament's got limited borrowing powers, not enough tax powers, and won't have control over about 15% of welfare. In Westminster, cuts for budget and Scottish Tories demand more is done with less money. It's an impossible circle to square. And meanwhile, Labour only agree the Scottish Parliament doesn't have enough powers when support for SNP increases. Everything for them is a means to an end. And by the way, a con like the vow won't work next time around. Ms Noakes, too many people in Scotland now realise that Westminster is broken and it's headed up by an anti-Scottish and anti-devolution Prime Minister, one who stated £1 spent in Croydon is of more value to the country than £1 spent in Strathclyde. He said that a Scottish MP should never be Prime Minister, and he wanted the Barnett formula scrapped, and actually as editor of The Spectator published an anti-Scottish poem. 62 countries have exercised their democratic right to leave the UK, and Westminster needs to recognise it's for the electorate in Scotland to choose if we're going to be that 63rd country. Now is the time for real change.
Imran Ahmed Khan. You're on mute.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. This debate is a fantastic opportunity to demonstrate exactly why Scottish independence would be catastrophic for the people of Scotland. Our United Kingdom continues to fight against COVID-19, employing the power of the Union and its government to deliver life-saving vaccinations across the United Kingdom, providing us all with a route out of lockdown. As this critical fight continues, the SNP have prioritised another independence referendum. Take, for example, their independence task force, launched on the 17th of January this year. Whilst we're at the pivotal moment in the battle against the virus and taking our first steps towards recovery, pulling our United Kingdom apart will damage our chances of recovery. In indulging their obsession with independence, including planning an independence roadmap, the SNP have failed to properly respond to the pandemic. In August last year, the SNP promised to expand testing capacity to 65,000 people per day, but the largest number of tests carried out in a single day in Scotland is 34,932. All the while, Her Majesty's government has been supporting the Scottish people. Around 780,000 Scottish jobs and the incomes of 157,000 self-employed Scots have been protected by the power of Her Majesty's Treasury's interventions. In rebuilding our United Kingdom after the pandemic, every effort has been made to ensure that no part is left behind. The £4.8 billion Levelling Up Fund embodies this commitment, with £800 million available across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to help invest in communities, high streets and local transport. The SNP's quite abysmal track record in government is only a taste of what would happen if the SNP were left completely in charge of Scotland. The SNP have presided over the lowest rate of job creation in the UK, watched Scottish schools drop to the lowest international scores in science and maths, and reduced the number of frontline officers protecting Scottish communities. Being dragged out of the United Kingdom will be a hugely damaging experience for Scotland's recovery and against the will of the Scottish people. Polls indicate an overwhelming majority of people support the union, and the petitioners responsible for today's debate underline this. Importantly, Ms Noakes, another independence referendum would make worthless the SNP's promise that the 2014 referendum will be a once-in-a-generation event. At this critical moment of our collective focus ought to be on rebuilding the entire UK and paving the way to greater prosperity, not focusing on damaging independence referenda. Scotland deserves better. Thank God the Union stands to support Scotland from the deficiencies of the Scottish National Party.
Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I offer my sincere apologies for my dress at the outset of the debate. It is also a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Wakefield. Like many citizens, I have a heritage which comes from Scotland and in England, and in my case, Ireland too. I am a proud unionist and believe in our United Kingdom. Our United Kingdom is one of the most successful political unions in history. In my constituency of Darlington, some 33 people have signed E-petition 570779, a small number of those who I am sure would not want to see our United Kingdom broken up by the separatists. Indeed, the continued refrain of the SNP on independence, despite the once-in-a-generation decision, is used to distract from the failings of their government in Holyrood, its internal party conflicts, their failure on education, their failure on health, their worsening polling data. This debate presents a great opportunity to shine a spotlight on the phenomenal level of support that this Conservative and Unionist government has provided to the people of Scotland during the pandemic, as indeed they have throughout the whole United Kingdom. This United Kingdom government has protected jobs and businesses, giving tangible proof to the argument that working together and supporting each and every country of our United Kingdom, we are better together, facing the challenge of the pandemic and its aftermath together. Across the UK, employers have been able to take advantage of the unprecedented levels of support, such as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, Self-Employed Income Scheme, and UK-backed business loans. In June last year, almost 800,000 Scottish jobs were being supported through the furlough scheme, and statistics from January show that over 360,000 Scottish workers were still on furlough. Over 431,000 self-employed people have been supported through the Self-Employed Income Scheme, and more than 90,000 Scottish businesses have been supported by the UK government-backed loans, worth almost £3.4 billion. At the same time, the Scottish Government struggled to distribute support to the business that needed it. Our vaccination programme across the UK, a programme that underpins our precious union, has seen the strength we gain from working together. If the SNP had their way and were part of the European Union's vaccination programme, it is likely that Scotland would not have achieved the number of vaccination first doses that we have achieved so far. Ms Noakes, despite the unprecedented situation we have faced this past year, and despite the constant negativity of the SNP, this one nation, Conservative and Unionist government has delivered for the people of the entire UK, and it will continue to do so into the future. Thank you.
Before I move to the front bench spokesman, can I remind them that they have 10 minutes each, which will allow a few minutes for the original mover of the motion to wind up at the end. Can I call Mari Black, please?
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be speaking in this debate, and I know it might be hard for others to believe, but I genuinely do try my best to understand where unionists are coming from in their defence of the UK as a union. And although I disagree with them more often than not, I always respect and accept what their position is. That's what keeps a democracy healthy, genuine, thoughtful debate. Now, today's debate is not about the merits of independence or the problems with independence. It's about whether Scotland should have another independence referendum. Now, although the two issues are intrinsically linked, it's important to keep that distinction in mind. The very basic principle on which all democracies are built is that it's for the people to exercise their democratic rights in free, fair and regular elections to determine what the future of their country should be. Now, to an extent, this is a hypothetical debate that we're having today. We're weeks away from the upcoming Scottish elections, where people in Scotland will again exercise their democratic right to choose the future direction of the country. Now, if the people in Scotland do elect a majority of members on an explicit pledge to have another independence referendum, then it's no longer hypothetical. In that scenario, there should be another independence referendum. There's no democratic or moral argument to state otherwise. But ultimately, time will tell. We're all politicians. We know how elections work. It is for us to present the future we want to pursue, and for the people to democratically endorse which plan they want to see put into action. And no one has the right to stand in the way of that. It's as simple as that. But to focus on Scotland in particular, we did hold a referendum on independence, and a majority in Scotland voted to give this union another chance. Now, a lot has happened since then, and I'll touch on some of that later. But it's important to remember that there was nothing in the Edinburgh Agreement stating that there would never be another independence referendum. In fact, there was cross-party agreement that nothing contained in the Smith Commission prevents Scotland becoming independent in the future. I remember back then watching the debates where the idea of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister was laughed off. The possibility that Scotland would be dragged out of the EU against its will was dismissed as scaremongering. Since then, any attempt to say that there hasn't been a material change is wishful thinking at best. Now, I was elected to my current role on a manifesto pledge to hold Westminster to account for the promises that were made. Now, any suggestion that we're not respecting the outcome of that referendum is a futile attempt to rewrite history. Supporting independence does not equate to disrespecting the outcome of the referendum. We wouldn't be in the position we're in if we hadn't respected the outcome. It means that we know we need to work to convince others. And that's why I find it quite curious that the only people who seem vehemently opposed to a second referendum are those who are passionately in favour of the union. Now, to address specifically some of the arguments that have been made today, we've heard that Alex Salmond said it was a once-in-a-generation vote. Well, the last general election was described by the current Prime Minister as a critical once-in-a-generation vote. Does this mean that there won't be a general election for a generation? I assume not. And although he might not like it, Alex Salmond doesn't hold the authority on Scotland's future anyway. Now, on the second main criticism, that we should be debating health and social security and the economy, for me, this shows a complete failure to meaningfully engage with the arguments being made. The reason most people support independence is not because of nationalism or flags, but rather because they see the actions and the attitudes of Westminster. Our Scottish Parliament spends millions every year mitigating policies from the UK governments that it more often than not didn't vote for. But people are recognising that it's only by having the powers of a normal, independent country that we can actually have the power to deliver that radical change that we need, particularly in the context of our post-COVID recovery, because we're certainly not getting that thinking from Westminster. Now, the Scottish Government disagreed with Brexit, but it still produced a framework for how it could work. This was rejected by Westminster. Now, in the situation that Scotland ever did vote for independence, then the SNP does not and should not dictate what that future looks like. But unionist parties are actually depriving people of what their vision would be, and then decrying the SNP for being the only ones talking about it. Like I said, we want independence because we think it will give us the means to provide a lot of the responses we think people need to see. And like I said at the beginning, though, the issue of timing is undoubtedly interlinked with our constitutional preferences. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But it got me thinking, if Scotland was already independent and we were debating whether to join the UK, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, what would the merits of this union be? Power would be moved to a parliament miles away, where you will be in the minority. You'll rarely get the governments you vote for. Those governments will have the ultimate control over your economy, your borders, your social security. They'll actually dictate how much money you can spend and what you can spend it on, and you're going to have nuclear weapons in your waters, whether you like it or not. So in that context, the fear of another referendum becomes much more understandable. The events of the last 6 to 7 years have shown that the case for the union is paper thin. Now, I sincerely respect and welcome the fact that there are people who disagree with independence, but it takes an epic leap to then say that the matter should never be discussed again, especially when a sizable amount of people in Scotland consistently disagree. Ultimately, it is for the people of Scotland to decide if and when a referendum should happen, and it's our job to listen.
Iain Murray.
Thank you very much, Ms Knox. It's a great pleasure to have you in the chair. Can I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Isloyn, who opened the debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I thought he gave an excellent and measured speech, and given he had spoken to the petitioners and expressed what they were trying to achieve by this debate, just shows you the breadth of what the petitioners were trying to do. And I was quite shocked, really shocked actually, when he said in his speech that the petitioners wished to remain anonymous because they feared for the consequences of speaking out in this debate. And I think that's why, and one of the main reasons, why we shouldn't have another independent referendum. It's hugely divisive. Businesses, charities, third sector organisations feel they can't speak out and make their voices heard. Members of the public can't speak out. There's division in families, there's division in workplaces, and really, really shocking that the petitioners feel as if they can't put their name publicly to this kind of petition. And again, we've just had another debate in this House where it's all about process. We've had none of the answers. We had 7 hours in the House of Commons chamber just last week on Wednesday, and had none of the answers with regards to the proposition that's been put forward. And that's one of the major reasons why this debate has turned into a debate about process rather than about what the actual issues will be. And the Honourable Lady, the SNP spokesperson in her speech there, talked about meaningfully engaging. There is no meaningful engagement at all in this debate because there is nothing in terms of the answering of the big questions. And I'll just give you an example, and Hansard will record this from last Wednesday, but the member for Edinburgh East who opened that debate last Wednesday, when he was challenged about some of these big questions on currency, on the EU, on borders, on debts and deficit, the list is pretty endless, he said that they wouldn't need to answer those at the moment because all of those would be addressed when we actually have an independence referendum. But just 2 speakers later from the SNP benches, we got a detailed analysis of how an independent Scotland's asylum policy would operate. So on the one hand, we have answers, and on the other hand, we don't. And I suspect it's because the answers to those big questions aren't forthcoming. And we've heard a number of times today, including from the petitioners and from the member for Isloyn in his opening speech, that the Scottish Government could be answering a whole number of questions, but also looking at a whole number of really important policies for the Scottish people. He talked about food poverty, he talked about energy poverty, he talked about the education system catching up. And isn't it strange that the Scottish education system, for the first time in its history, is plummeting down the international rankings, and we hear nothing about that. All at a time, of course, when today the Scottish Government uses precious Scottish Government time in Parliament, just 24 hours before Parliament's last full day, to bring forward another referendum bill. Not a bill on educational attainment, not a bill on food poverty, not a bill on how to ensure that those 220 people who were queued up in the snow and sub-zero temperatures in George Square are fed and given a home, not a bill on that. not a bill on poverty, not a bill on how we grow businesses, not a bill on any of those things, but a bill to have another referendum. It's the only priority that the Scottish National Party have, and it's paralysing our politics, it's paralysing our Parliament, and as we've heard from the petitioners, it's poisoning our national discourse. So where is the debate about a fairer society, and where is the debate about some of these big questions? And the member for Oakland South Perthshire talked, and I think inaccurately, tried to muddy the line between patriotism and nationalism. It's as if you're not a nationalist, you're not a patriot. Well, that surely can't be the case. We're all patriotic about our country. But you can be a patriot, you can celebrate everything that's Scottish, and I certainly do, without being a nationalist. And I think blurring that line is incredibly dangerous. And then he talked very eloquently, he was right. He talked about the damage that leaving the EU is having on Scotland and the rest of the country, but then didn't spend any time to tell us what the SNP's plan would be to get back into the EU, because it's contradictory and impossible to deliver, and that's not being honest with the Scottish people. And then we heard the member for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale, rightly challenging the SNP on rewriting history, because rewriting history is really the only tool they have in their box at the moment. By saying things that didn't happen, by making assertions about what other people have said and what the Scottish Parliament's for, and then making this huge assertion that the SNP's voice is the voice of the Scottish people. It is not. The Scottish people is much, much wider than that, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that I could speak on behalf of all of the Scottish people, and I think the SNP shouldn't do so as well. And then we had other contributions. The member for Coatbridge, Chryston and Bells Hill talked about nobody talking about a referendum anytime soon. Well, nobody except for the First Minister. Nobody except for the Cabinet Secretary who's responsible for this, Mike Russell. Nobody except for the SNP leader at Westminster, the member for Ross Skye on the Cabber, who all talked about a potential independent referendum this year. Can you imagine, when most of these Scots are thinking about their jobs, they're worried about their livelihoods, they're concerned about their health and that of their family and friends and their colleagues, coming out of the most serious economic and health crisis that probably the country has ever seen in peacetime, that we go straight into an independence referendum? And here's a little bit of a conundrum for the members who said, oh, we're not talking about this, having it this year. We'll wait till COVID's over because it'd be too difficult at this moment in time to have this big debate and get people to the polls whilst there's a pandemic on. Apart from the fact we're having a Scottish election on the 6th of May when people are going to the polls. So again, much more contradictory stuff from the Scottish National Party. Ms Snooks, we also heard the member from Darlington. This is wonderful seeing these screens in this new hybrid situation, because the member for Darlington talked about his Scottish heritage and how he was very proud of it. And whilst he was doing that, other members from the SNP were shaking his head. The member for Angus shook his head as if it wasn't a point that was legitimately allowed to be made, because he's not living in Scotland at the moment and represents Darlington. He's every right to celebrate his Scottish heritage. We should all be celebrating it with him. He's very welcome to tell us that he wants Scotland to stay in the United Kingdom because it's part of him and part of his family's history. So it's wonderful to see people's reactions on the screen when you make these points, because it's quite clear that this is very much about being anti the rest of the United Kingdom rather than about making a proper argument. The member for Angus also went on to say that this debate shows the worst of Westminster. This debate was called by the public. This is a Petitions Committee, and if a petitioner gets the relevant number of petitions on the signatures, they're able to have this debate, and that's why this debate is happening. The member for Kilmarnock and Loudon talks of sovereignty and talked very much about the Smith Commission and other issues like that. But he's right. The Scottish Parliament isn't one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world. He's right to make that assertion. Why is it not? Because the powers that it has aren't being used. It has the potential to be the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. If you use those powers in social security that the SNP members seem to think the Scottish Parliament doesn't have. Sections 25, 26, 27 of the Scotland Act of 2016 that came out of the cross-party Smith Commission means that Scotland can essentially design its own social security system. What did the SNP Scottish Government do? They handed all the powers back to Westminster till at least 2024, 8 years after the cross-party Smith Commission was signed. So by using the powers of the Scottish Parliament, you make it one of the most powered of all parliaments in the world. By not using the powers, you can sit back and say we have no powers and it's everybody else's fault. What we need to be concentrating on now is a national COVID recovery plan. We need an NHS recovery for all those people that have missed out on their treatments for cancer and other illnesses, need to get their treatments, need to get their diagnosis. We need that to be at the forefront of everything that we do post the next election. We need an education catch-up. All those kids that have been left behind. This is an education system that was in a poor place before the pandemic and is in an even worse place now. The NHS was in a poor place before the pandemic and is in an even worse place now. We need a jobs and business recovery. An economy in Scotland that was in a bad place before the pandemic and is in an even worse place now. We need a climate recovery. All those wonderful climate targets that the Scottish Government set, great to set targets, won't meet any of them. We were in a dreadful place with regards to climate targets before the pandemic, and we're in an even worse place now. And we need a community recovery. It was in a very, very bad place before the pandemic. We have a housing crisis. We have local services starved of cash. We have billions out of local council budgets. So it was in a bad place before the pandemic, so we need that recovery now. What the Scottish Labour Party wants to do, and I can read from Keir Starmer's speech, the leader of the Labour Party, when he talked about Scotland in a modern United Kingdom and the process of devolution going forward. There doesn't have to be a choice between this binary choice between the broken status quo and separation. There is another way that this can be done, and it's about looking at the United Kingdom in a post-Brexit Britain and how it manages itself. And he said, with regards to the consequences of independence and indeed another referendum, he said, that's why the First Minister's call for an independence referendum in the next Scottish Parliament, perhaps even as early as next year, this was in December, so 2021, is so misguided. Given the division and damage this would cause, particularly during the pandemic, no responsible First Minister should contemplate it, and no responsible Prime Minister would grant it. That's the words of the leader of the Labour Party. And the new leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Anas Sauer, has been pretty clear that we will go into that election on the 6th of May, saying quite clearly that we're setting aside every single bit of constitutional division to unite our country and put forward a national COVID recovery plan to ensure that people don't need to worry about their health, people don't need to worry about their jobs, and people don't need to worry about their livelihoods, because their Scottish Government, post the elections in May, will have that as their sole focus and their only focus. Thank you very much indeed.
Minister.
Thank you, Ms Noakes, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And may I also begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Isloyne for introducing the debate so effectively and with great measure and care for what the people were asking us to consider today. And I'm grateful for the contributions that we've heard from Right Honourable and Honourable Members on a subject that does arouse considerable passions. It's worth restating the reason why we are here today. It is because over 110,000 people have put their name to a petition against a second separation referendum in Scotland. And that is a view that I think chimes with views right across Scotland and the whole United Kingdom. There is no pressing demand evident that this is what we should be putting top of our list in our debates. The SNP members are always happy to cite opinion polls that back up their case. They don't mention the ones recently that have put the majority view against separation. But the most recent batch of polls shows that it's for less than 10% of people that constitutional issues are the primary focus and are what going to drive their voting behaviour. As many members have pointed out today, this is absolutely not the time to be obsessing about process, about constitutional measures, when we are recovering from one of the worst public health crises and economic challenges we have had in our history. People in all parts of the country want to see us working in partnership to tackle the pandemic and drive the recovery we want to see. And I thought the contribution from the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh West was absolutely spot on in that it's people want to know how we're going to, if their child's education has suffered, or their mental health, or they're worried about their job, or a whole range of other issues that are pressing for them. That's what they want us to be talking about. And I was also deeply troubled by the point that my honourable friend, the member for Murray, raised, that this is already starting to arouse some deeply unpleasant behaviour. He referenced a death threat. The honourable gentleman for Edinburgh South rightly highlighted that it is appalling that the organiser of this petition felt they had to remain anonymous for fear of reprisals. That's what we would set in train again if we went down the path of another divisive referendum. And it is quite clear that the SNP want to drive this as fast as they can. The honourable member for Angus said it in as many words: go into overdrive. Once the Scottish Parliament elections out the way, that's what they will be focusing on. The honourable gentleman for Edinburgh East in last week's debate said he doesn't really mind whether it was later this year or early next year that we would go into the divisiveness of another referendum, but that's when it's going to be. That's not what Scotland needs or wants. And my right honourable friend for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale hit the nail on the head. They've never stopped since the 2014 referendum agitating, bringing up every sense of grievance to chip away, nip away, to have another vote. It's a never-ending. And they would keep going. They will keep going. But that's not what, as I say, the people of Scotland need or want. We heard it last week. A rare chance that an opposition party gets to set the tone of the subject for debate in Parliament. And they could have used it to look at what lessons we are learning from the current pandemic, so that we can avoid future ones. They could have debated the economic challenges. They could have focused on what measures we're going to take to get the 100,000 Scottish people who've sadly lost their jobs due to COVID back into work. They could have debated how they were going to tackle waiting lists, catch up the education for the 750,000 Scottish school children who haven't had their full education or development this year, how to clear the backlog of some 40,000 criminal and civil legal cases. There are so many issues they could have talked on. They could have talked about the vaccination programme. But of course, given that the SNP wanted the UK to be part of the EU vaccination programme and procurement, perhaps that's why they didn't want to talk about that. But no, they want to talk about the division and divisiveness of another separation referendum. And I think that is the wrong focus. We have seen how much we can achieve together. All spheres of government, be it local, Scottish, UK, working together to help us get through the pandemic and rebuild. And we've seen, for example, how the British Armed Forces are helping to establish new vaccine centres right across Scotland and helping to vaccinate people. A programme that is delivering huge strides forward to getting us back together. We are promoting our green industrial revolution to invest in the technologies and industries of the future. A programme that will support levelling up and up to 250,000 new jobs. Glasgow, of course, will be hosting COP26 later this year. A golden opportunity to showcase the best of what we can offer and demonstrate our global leadership in this vital issue. But just at the time that the world's eyes would be on us, the SNP would have us fighting each other. Family against family, community against community. That's not what we want. And if I can just pick up on some of the other points that members have made during the course of this debate. The Honourable Gentleman for Edinburgh South, again, I thought was on the money when he criticised the SNP members for confusing patriotism and nationalism. How insulting that if you don't buy in to the divisive programme of the nationalists, that you are somehow less Scottish. They don't speak for all of Scotland. They speak for those who are obsessed about smashing up the world's most successful economic and social partnership. Brexit has been raised a number of times. I just want to challenge the point that is often made that so much has changed since the 2014 referendum with Brexit. But perhaps the SNP members would like to revisit their prospectus for separation, Scotland's future, which contained a warning that Scotland should vote for independence to stop Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will. It was there. It was a once-in-a-generation vote. Although, as my honourable friend for Dumfriesshire said, apparently that was now just a get-out-the-vote strategy, and we weren't to believe it. I'm afraid they are making it up as they go along. It was a decisive vote. It was once in a generation. And the other point about Brexit I would like to make, well, 2 points in fact. Firstly, if, as the SNP members have referenced, that Brexit has been so damaging to Scotland's exports and trade, what on earth did they think would happen if we broke up the UK single market? Is that what business is really looking for as they rebuild after the pandemic? That they add in another risk, uncertainty, and all the cost and division that would cause? Is that what they're asking for? I don't think so. The UK government is continuing to drive forward its ambitious programme of economic growth to support people and businesses across Scotland and the UK. This includes programmes like city deals and the new trade deals and export support. That is the concrete work that is going on to help rebuild Scotland's economy and invest in the future. The budget earlier this month demonstrated this government's commitment to operating on a truly UK-wide basis, from extensions to furlough, the self-employed scheme, the Levelling Up Fund, benefiting businesses and citizens right across the UK. We don't need another divisive referendum. We had the vote. People want us to focus on rebuilding, on catching up, on investing in the future. That's what this coming election in Scotland is about. That's how people will decide which party they're going to support. And I look forward to a lively debate between my honourable friend for Murray, the honourable gentleman for Edinburgh South Party, the honourable lady for Edinburgh West Party, and others, on all these key issues, on jobs, on education, on health, on transport, on clean energy, and the many other areas that people are concerned about. We don't need another referendum on separation. That is what the UK government is focused on, rebuilding. And I very much agree in conclusion, Ms Noakes, with the petitioners, who I congratulate again on securing this very important debate. And once again, I congratulate the Honourable Member for Sloan for introducing it so effectively. Thank you.
Can I bring in Chris Evans to wind up, please?
Thanks, Ms Noakes. This has been, I think, a very measured and good debate. I think there has been passions on both sides, as you would expect from something so stirs up such passion. However, I do hope those who want to indulge in personal abuse because someone has a different view to them in the wider public learn from the climate of this debate today. It is my genuine belief that we will get nowhere in our political discourse, as we've seen with the Brexit referendum and now and in the past the Scottish referendum, if all we are doing is shouting at each other and we won't be able to hear what the others are saying. I would say also, from a Welsh perspective, as many people have liked to do in this debate, compare Wales to Scotland, the truth is, this is the warning I would have to Scottish politicians. We have a danger here of disappearing down a constitutional rabbit hole. There's no good talking about constitution all the time. As I said in my earlier speech, the idea of jam tomorrow is not going to cut it anymore. These are desperate times. We live in a pandemic that's never been seen before. We face an economic downturn like never before. Constitutional arguments will become secondary to that. Therefore, I say this. We can either set the debate as independence versus unionist, or we can set the debate of how we want our country, our United Kingdom, to look in the coming years. Thank you, Mr. Noakes.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 570779 relating to consent for a referendum on Scottish independence. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended now until 6:15 p.m. Please, all members, leave the room promptly by the exit door on the left while observing social distancing.